The water pressure dropped to nothing at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning. I know the exact time because that's when Diane Mercer called my phone for the first time, her voice tight with the kind of panic that comes from turning on a kitchen faucet and hearing it cough air. By noon, 6 more board members had called. By 1 p.m., the entire Ridgeline Acres HOA understood that the well pump supplying water to 43 homes had stopped running, and that the pump sat on my property, inside my garage, powered by my electrical panel. The panel they had cut 2 days earlier over $340 in disputed dues. I didn't answer any of the calls. I was sitting on my back porch with a glass of iced tea, city water, not well water, because my house had never been on the community system, watching the August heat shimmer over the canyon and listening to my phone vibrate itself across the table. They had no idea what they'd done, but they were about to learn. It started 4 months earlier, in April, when the HOA sent their first violation notice. The letter arrived on a Thursday, printed on cream cardstock with the Ridgeline Acres logo embossed at the top, and it cited my front yard mesquite tree as being inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. The tree was 60 years old, older than the development by 3 decades, and it had been there when I bought the property in 2011. The HOA had been incorporated in 2015, for years after I closed, and had spent the time since aggressively enforcing bylaws on homes that predated the covenants. I am not a man who ignores correspondence. I read the letter twice, pulled my title report, confirmed that my deed contained no restrictive covenants recorded prior to purchase, and replied with a polite, factual email explaining that my property was not subject to the HOA's landscape provisions. I attached the relevant deed language and the county recorder's certification. The response came from Diane Mercer, board president. She informed me that all properties within the Ridgeline Acres boundary were subject to community standards regardless of covenant date, and that my refusal to comply would result in fines. I forwarded the exchange to my attorney, Ben Castillo, who had handled my original closing. Ben sent a single-page letter to the HOA outlining the legal distinction between properties bound by recorded covenants and properties that were not. He used small words. He cited 3 Arizona appellate cases. He closed with a recommendation that the board consult qualified legal counsel before proceeding further. The HOA fined me $340 anyway. The invoice arrived in May, itemizing 2 violations: failure to remove non-compliant vegetation and failure to respond to board directives. I did not pay it. I sent a second email, calmer than I felt, reiterating that I was not subject to HOA authority and that no legal instrument gave them standing to levy fines against my property. Diane's reply was 4 sentences long. It said the fine was valid, that it would continue to accrue monthly, and that failure to pay would result in enforcement action. I called Ben. He told me enforcement action in this context likely meant a lawsuit, which the HOA would lose, but which would cost me time and legal fees to defend. He recommended I document everything and wait for them to make the next move. They made it in July. The lien notice arrived by certified mail. The HOA had recorded a lien against my property for $680, the original fine plus 2 months of accrual, and the notice stated that continued non-payment could result in foreclosure proceedings. A lien on property they had no covenant authority over, for a tree that had been growing in Arizona soil since 1964. I sat with that notice for a long time. Then I pulled the well pump documentation. When I bought the property in 2011, the disclosure packet included an easement agreement filed by the prior owner in 2009. The agreement granted the nascent Ridgeline Acres development access to the private well on my land, a deep drilled well that predated the development by 15 years, in exchange for the developer covering the cost of upgrading the pump system and running distribution lines to the planned homes. The easement was specific. Access was granted in perpetuity provided the HOA maintained the pump and associated equipment in good working order. But the easement also contained a clause I had not thought about in years. Either party could terminate the agreement with 90 days written notice if the other party breached the terms or engaged in conduct materially adverse to the grantor's property rights. I read that clause 3 times. Then I opened a new document and started drafting. The termination notice went out on July 18th, sent via certified mail and email to every board member, the HOA's registered agent, and their property management company. It cited the lien as conduct materially adverse to my property rights, referenced the unlawful assertion of covenant authority, and provided formal notice that the well easement would terminate in 90 days unless the lien was released and all fines rescinded. Diane called me directly the next morning. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was clipped and dismissive, saying the termination threat was not legally viable and that the HOA would proceed with enforcement. Ben reviewed my notice and the easement language. He said it was airtight. The 90 days ran out on October 16th. The HOA did not release the lien. They did not rescind the fines. On October 14th, 2 days before the termination became effective, they cut my power. The work crew arrived at 7:35 in the morning. I was drinking coffee on the back porch when I heard the truck pull up, and by the time I reached the front yard, 2 men in utility vests were standing at my electrical meter with a lockout device. One of them, a younger guy with sunburned forearms, saw me coming and held up a clipboard. "Work order from the HOA," he said. "Delinquent account. We're authorized to disconnect service until payment is received." I told him he was about to disconnect power to a private residence based on a work order issued by an organization with no legal authority over the property. I told him if he proceeded, he would be personally liable for any damages that resulted. He looked at the clipboard, looked at me, and made a phone call. Whoever he spoke to told him to finish the job. He locked out the meter, tagged it, and left. The house went quiet. No hum from the refrigerator, no software from the HVAC system. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, feeling the stillness settle, and then I walked into the garage. The well pump controller was mounted on the wall near my main panel, a gray metal box with a simple on-off switch and a pressure gauge that had been reading 52 psi since I checked it last week. The pump itself sat 280 feet down in the earth, pulling clean, cold water from an aquifer that had been there for 10,000 years and sending it up through PVC lines that branched off my property to every house on Ridgeline Acres. 43 homes, 160 people, all of them drinking, cooking, showering, and watering with water that came through a pump system sitting on my land, inside my garage, powered by my electrical panel. The panel the HOA had just cut. I flipped the breaker to the pump controller. The green power light went dark. The gauge needle dropped slowly as the residual pressure in the system bled off. By the time it hit zero, the water in every house on the street had stopped flowing. I took a photograph of the dark controller, the dead gauge, and the lockout tag on my meter outside. Then I sent a single email to the HOA board with all 3 images attached. Per the easement termination notice sent July 18th and effective October 16th, access to the well on my property has been revoked. As you have also disconnected power to my home, the pump system is no longer operational. I will not be restoring service until the lien is released, all fines are rescinded, and my electrical service is restored without condition. Regards, Paul Hendricks. I sent the email at 8:22 a.m. Diane called at 8:29. I declined the call and turned my phone face down on the counter. The attorney showed up at 10:15. His name was Gregory Voss, and he arrived in a black Audi with HOA legal counsel printed on the business card he handed me through the screen door. He was polished, professional, and completely certain that a brief conversation would resolve the matter. He explained that the HOA had a legitimate easement to the well, that my termination notice was not enforceable under Arizona law, and that interrupting water service to 43 homes was both illegal and actionable. I asked him if he had read the easement agreement. He said he had. I asked him if he had noted the termination clause. He said that clause required cause, and that the HOA's enforcement actions did not constitute cause. I handed him a printed copy of the lien notice, the original violation letter citing the mesquite tree, and Ben Castillo's letter explaining that my property was not subject to covenant authority. I asked him to explain how recording a fraudulent lien against property the HOA had no legal standing to encumber did not constitute conduct materially adverse to my rights as grantor. Voss read the documents carefully. His expression did not change, but his posture did. He asked if I would consider a temporary restoration of service while the board reviewed the matter. I told him the pump ran on electricity, and the HOA had disconnected my power. Even if I wanted to restore service, I couldn't until the meter was reconnected. He asked if I would restore the pump once power was returned. I told him I would restore the pump when the lien was released, the fines were rescinded in writing, and the HOA provided a signed acknowledgement that my property was not subject to covenant authority. Until then, the easement termination stood, and the whale remained offline. Voss left without another word. The call started after lunch. Diane again, then 2 other board members, then residents I had never spoken to, all asking variations of the same question. When would the water come back? I didn't answer any of them. I was sitting on the porch with my second glass of iced tea, watching a pair of red-tailed hawks work the thermals over the canyon, when Ben called. "Paul," he said, "you're going to get sued." "I know. They're going to claim you're holding the community hostage." "They cut my power, Ben. The pump doesn't run without power. That's not hostage-taking. That's physics." There was a pause. Then Ben laughed, a short, surprised sound. "You planned this." I gave them 90 days. Jesus, Paul. How long before they fold? If Voss is any good, he's already told them they can't win. If Diane overrules him, maybe 3 days. Maybe less, if someone's kid needs a bath badly enough. The water stayed off for 62 hours. The emergency board meeting happened on Thursday evening in Diane Mercer's living room. I know this because Eleanor Shepard, a neighbor 2 houses down who had been quietly furious with the HOA for years, texted me a summary afterward. 17 residents had shown up, most of them angry, and the meeting had devolved into shouting within 20 minutes. People wanted to know why the water was off. They wanted to know why the HOA had cut power to a private home. They wanted to know, most of all, when their showers would work again. Diane had tried to explain the lien, the fines, the enforcement authority. Someone asked if Paul Hendrick's property was actually subject to the HOA covenants. Diane said all properties in Ridgeline Acres were subject to community standards. Gregory Voss, present at the meeting in his capacity as legal counsel, had apparently contradicted her in front of the entire room. He stated that after reviewing the title history, Hendrick's property predated the HOA covenants and was not bound by them. He stated that the lien was legally unsupportable and that continuing to pursue it exposed the HOA to a countersuit for slander of title. He also stated that the easement termination was valid and that Hendricks was within his rights to revoke well access. Eleanor said Diane's face had gone white. The vote to release the lien was unanimous. The vote to rescind all fines was 7-1, with Diane abstaining. Voss drafted the documentation that night. At 9:47 p.m., I received an email from the HOA board containing 3 attachments: a lien release recorded with the county that afternoon, a formal rescission of all fines and violations, and a signed letter acknowledging that my property was not subject to HOA covenant authority and that no future enforcement actions would be taken against it. The 4th attachment was a request, politely worded, asking if I would consider restoring well access. I called the utility company first thing Friday morning. They had a crew out by 10 a.m., and the lockout came off my meter without incident. The power came back on at 10:23. I walked into the garage, flipped the breaker to the pump controller, and watched the green light come on. The gauge needle climbed smoothly to 54 psi and held. I sent a 1-line email to the HOA. While service restored. By noon, water was flowing again to every house on the street. Diane Mercer resigned from the board the following week, citing personal reasons. Gregory Voss sent me a separate email, brief and professional, saying that the HOA would be revising its enforcement policies and that he had recommended the board conduct a full title review of all properties before pursuing future violations. He thanked me for my patience during the dispute, which I found darkly funny. The mesquite tree is still in my front yard. It leafed out beautifully this spring, the branches thick with green, and I sit under it most mornings with my coffee and watch the canyon light come up over the ridge. Ben Castillo called a few weeks after everything settled to check in. I told him the water was running, the power was on, and the HOA had been notably quiet since the lien release. He asked if I felt vindicated. I told him I didn't need vindication. I just needed them to understand what a property line actually means. Some people learn that by reading the deed. Some people learn it by reading the law. And some people, apparently, need to learn it by turning on the faucet and hearing nothing come out. The well is still mine. The water is still theirs, as long as the easement holds. But the easement holds because I allow it to, not because they demand it. And everyone on Ridgeline Acres now understands the difference. I water the mesquite tree every Sunday. It's 61 years old now, older than most of the people who tried to make me cut it down, and it'll be here long after they're gone. That feels about right. Some lessons take longer to sink in than others. But given enough time and the right pressure, everything eventually finds its level.